Number 1. Todd Greathouse. On May 29, 2016, in Joplin, Missouri, 61-year-old Willana Anita Dunn was inside the home she rented from her landlord, Todd Greathouse. It was a Sunday. By the end of that day, she would be dead, and her body would be transported to an abandoned mine shaft west of the city, where investigators would later recover her remains weighted down beneath the surface of a water-filled pit. Everything that unfolded in the hours that followed traced back to the confrontation that took place inside that rental house. Anita Dunn had lived there for some time. Todd Greathouse, then 53, owned the property while living in nearby Webb City. Few in the community knew that he had a past homicide conviction from 1983 or that he was still on parole. In the months leading up to Dunn's death, he had been arrested on a drug charge and had missed a required court date, adding more strain to his situation. According to Greathouse's later testimony, he arrived at Dunn's home on May 29th to talk with her. He claimed they had been involved in a brief secret affair and said she threatened to reveal it to his wife. Her family disputed any suggestion of an affair, and there is no independent confirmation beyond his account. What is verified is that he was inside her home that day and that the interaction turned violent. Greathouse told the jury that Dunn placed a handgun on the table during their argument and that he perceived it as a threat. Investigators were unable to confirm this claim. It came solely from him. He described grabbing her by the throat with his hands, then using a towel, and eventually an electrical or lamp cord as the strangulation continued. Medical findings confirmed that Dunn died by strangulation. A defense expert later testified that she had significant heart disease, potentially making her more susceptible to sudden cardiac arrest, but the sequence of force described by Greathouse established a prolonged assault. Once Dunn was dead, Greathouse worked quickly to hide what happened. He placed her body into his vehicle and drove to an abandoned mine property west of Joplin. The shafts in that area run deep and are partially submerged. Greathouse weighted the body with stones and dropped it into one of the water-filled shafts, where he believed it would not be found. On May 30th, the next morning, Greathouse and his wife went to the Joplin Police Department to report Dunn missing. He told officers they had not seen her since mid-May and suggested she might have been the victim of a burglary. He pointed to a mark on her door as evidence of forced entry. When officers examined the house, the details did not align with his explanation. There were no consistent signs of a break-in and no evidence of a struggle with an unknown intruder. During the early phase of the investigation, Dunn's abandoned wallet was found containing an address linked to a previous Webb City residence she had rented from the Greathouses. This strengthened investigators' focus on Todd Greathouse. Detectives obtained her cell phone records, and the tower data pointed toward the mineland west of Joplin. Search teams lowered an underwater camera into one of the shafts and located a body weighed down with rocks. Divers later recovered the remains and identified them as Anita Dunn. At the same time, statements from people close to Greathouse further implicated him. He had told his wife what happened. He also confessed to his sister. His sister then informed a minister, who contacted police. When investigators questioned him, Greathouse eventually disclosed the location where he had hidden Dunn's handgun at his workplace. Combined with the recovery of the body, the phone data, and the inconsistencies in his missing person story, the evidence formed a clear picture. Greathouse was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. His trial began in Jasper County in September 2017. He testified in his own defense, repeating his claim that the killing was unintentional and occurred during a panic-driven confrontation. The prosecution emphasized the escalation from manual strangulation to the use of a towel and then a cord, followed by the effort to conceal the body and stage a false narrative for police. The jury deliberated for roughly 25 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder. Missouri law mandates life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder unless the death penalty is imposed. Some coverage at the time described his punishment as a 50-year sentence without parole, while other verified sources characterize it as life without parole, which aligns with Missouri statute. Reports differ on the phrasing, but all credible summaries agree he will never be eligible for release. Today, Todd Greathouse remains incarcerated in a Missouri state prison. The investigation into Anita Dunn's disappearance showed how quickly a staged burglary narrative can fall apart under scrutiny, and how physical evidence, digital records, and witness disclosures ultimately led investigators from a rental home in Joplin to a concealed body deep inside an abandoned mine shaft. Number 2. James Pack. Derek Thompson was 19, living with his mother, Susan Johnson, in the attached apartment at 17 Secaucus Road in Biddeford, Maine. His girlfriend, 18-year-old Olivia Welch, had moved in with them. On the afternoon of December 29, 2012, the three of them were inside the apartment they rented from their landlord, 74-year-old James Pack, whose home was directly connected to theirs. Snow had fallen that day, and the shared driveway was tight. As they moved their cars to clear space, another argument broke out between the family and their landlord. These confrontations had happened before, but this one escalated quickly. Pack came outside angry about parking and the positioning of the vehicles. Court documents and police statements later showed that he yelled at the tenants and told them they were disrespecting his property. The argument intensified in the driveway, and Derek and his mother went back inside to avoid further confrontation. The tension, however, did not stop at the doorway. According to the later affidavit and civil case records, Pack followed the argument back to his portion of the home, still furious, and at one point made direct threats. Derek, Welch, and Johnson called 911 to report that their landlord had threatened to kill them. At approximately 6:45 in the evening, a Biddeford police officer, Edward Dexter, arrived at the property. He first spoke with the tenants inside their apartment, documenting the report that Pack had threatened their lives. Dexter then crossed into the landlord's side of the connected structure and spoke with Pack. According to the officer's later testimony, Pack remained angry and repeated that he had nothing to lose. The officer warned him against making threats, but categorized the disagreement as a civil landlord-tenant conflict. Dexter returned to the tenant's apartment, told them the situation appeared calm, and left the property at approximately 6:51 p.m. Within minutes of the police cruiser pulling away, the situation changed. Pack went into his home, retrieved a handgun, and walked toward the interior door leading into the tenant's apartment. Evidence presented in court shows that he opened that door, stepped inside, and immediately began firing. Derek Thompson was shot first. Welch was shot soon after. Johnson was also hit. Welch and Thompson died from their wounds on the floor of their apartment. Johnson survived by lying still and pretending to be dead. Once Pack left the room, she reached for her phone and placed a second 911 call at approximately 6:54 p.m., only a few minutes after the officer had departed. Police returned to the scene to find 2 victims dead and a third critically wounded. Pack had retreated back into his living quarters, and responding officers established a perimeter around the property. A standoff followed that lasted nearly 3 hours. Negotiators attempted to make contact, and at around 10 p.m., Pack surrendered in the driveway without further violence. He was taken into custody and charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The investigation recovered the handgun used in the shooting and documented the sequence of events inside the apartment. In March of 2013, Pack entered an initial plea of not guilty. In the following year, he added a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, supported by defense claims that he had suffered a mini-stroke and cognitive changes leading up to the crime. Reports indicate that psychologists evaluated him, but the case never proceeded to a full trial on that basis. Instead, on February 3, 2016, Pack changed his plea to guilty on all charges, 2 counts of murder for the deaths of Thompson and Welch, and 1 count of aggravated attempted murder for the shooting of Johnson. His attorneys stated that he wished to spare both families the ordeal of trial. On February 11, 2016, in York County Superior Court, Pack was sentenced to life in prison for the murders, along with an additional 30-year term for the attempted murder. The structure of the sentence ensured that he would never be released. The state's sentencing record emphasized the rapid escalation of the conflict, the explicit threats made before police arrived, and the fact that Pack carried out the shootings within minutes of the officer's departure. Johnson later described how quickly the incident unfolded and how the family believed they were safe once the officer had left. Pack remained in state custody until May of 2024, when the Maine Department of Corrections confirmed that he had died at age 86 while serving his life sentence at Mountain View Correctional Facility. Number 3. Stanley Anthony Jensen. On the evening of October 25, 2019, deputies from the Marion County Sheriff's Office were dispatched to a property on Southeast 59th Street near Ocala, Florida. It was just after 8:30 p.m. When they entered the rental home, they found 49-year-old tenant Mark Bruss lying inside with multiple gunshot wounds. The only other person in the unit was his landlord, 57-year-old Stanley Anthony Jensen, who was taken into custody at the scene. What appeared at first to be a violent confrontation inside a small rental property quickly became the center of a homicide investigation that traced back through a full day of escalating disputes. Earlier that Friday, deputies had already been to the property several times. Jensen had called them repeatedly because he was trying to remove Bruss from the home over what he described as unpaid rent and ongoing problems with the tenant. Investigators later documented that deputies explained the legal eviction process to him and made it clear he could not force the tenant out himself. They instructed him not to return to the home and to handle the matter through the civil courts. Despite that warning, Jensen remained focused on the eviction and continued approaching the residents. Throughout the afternoon, the dispute continued to intensify. Multiple calls were logged as Jensen attempted to regain control of the property. Reports from deputies show that they spoke with him more than once, reiterating that he had no legal authority to enter the tenant's living space or remove him by force. By early evening, they left the area, believing the situation had stabilized for the moment. Within hours, however, another emergency call came in from the same address. What happened inside the rental unit that evening is described differently by the two sides of the case. Jensen told investigators that he returned to the home because he heard yelling and believed something was wrong inside. According to his account, when he entered the residence, Bruss confronted him with a machete. Jensen claimed that Bruss refused to drop the weapon and advanced toward him, forcing him to fire his handgun several times in self-defense. Some statements from the defense describe as many as 6 rounds being fired. Prosecutors, however, emphasized that there were no independent witnesses to support Jensen's version of the struggle. When deputies arrived around 8:30 that night, they found Bruss already deceased from gunshot wounds. Jensen was still inside the unit and was immediately detained. Detectives processed the scene, collected physical evidence, and documented the trajectory of events that had unfolded earlier that day. Investigators noted that deputies had previously ordered Jensen not to return to the rental property and that his decision to re-enter the home was a central point in the state's case. As the investigation progressed, the prosecution would argue that the shooting occurred not out of fear, but out of anger and frustration during an ongoing eviction dispute. Before the case went to trial, Jensen sought immunity under Florida's Stand Your Ground law. A hearing was held in Marion County Circuit Court, where both sides presented evidence. Judge Anthony Taddy reviewed the record and denied the motion. In his ruling, he found that the evidence showed Jensen armed himself, returned to the tenant's residence despite being instructed not to, and initiated contact inside the home. This conduct, the judge determined, did not qualify for immunity under the statute. The case moved to trial in April 2022. An 8-member jury heard testimony from deputies, forensic personnel, and the individuals involved in the earlier calls that day. The prosecution focused on the sequence of events that led to the shooting: a landlord who had repeatedly attempted to evict his tenant outside the legal process, multiple warnings from law enforcement to stay away, and a final return to the property that ended in a fatal use of force. The defense maintained the position that Bruss had been armed with a machete and that Jensen fired only because he believed he had no other option. On April 27, 2022, the jury found Stanley Anthony Jensen guilty of second-degree murder. A sentencing hearing followed in July, during which the court considered arguments from both sides and the findings of the pre-sentence investigation. Judge Toddy imposed a 50-year prison sentence with a mandatory minimum of 25 years before Jensen would be eligible for release. Number 4. Javier Ortol. On October 21, 2013, in East Naples, Florida, a tenant walked out of his home on Okeechobee Street after seeing his landlord's van pull up near the mailbox. The man who stepped outside was 51-year-old Edward Malone. The man waiting in the driver's seat was his 78-year-old landlord, Javier Ortol. What began as an argument over overdue rent would end with a single gunshot to Maloney's chest, a death in the driveway, and a murder trial that rejected Ortol's claim of self-defense. The rental house sat in a quiet neighborhood of older, single-story homes. Ortol had owned the property for roughly 2 decades, renting it out to tenants while living in the same area of Collier County. He was widely known as elderly, physically limited, and dependent on an electronic wheelchair for mobility. Friends later told investigators that he always carried a firearm and had a concealed weapons permit, a habit they considered part of his daily routine rather than a response to any specific danger. Malone, the tenant, had a long history of arrests in Collier County, dating back to the early 1990s. Prosecutors later confirmed these records publicly, and they became part of the defense's effort to portray Ortol as a frail landlord facing someone with a reputation for volatility. But on the morning of October 21st, the issue at stake was simple and verified. The rent was overdue, and Ortol drove to the home to confront his tenant about the money he owed. According to witness accounts and sheriff's reports, Malone came out to meet him at the mailbox area. Deputies later said Ortol began yelling at him about unpaid rent, escalating a dispute that had likely been building for weeks. At some point during the argument, Maloney's cell phone dropped into the floorboard area inside Ortol's van. When Maloney leaned in or reached inside the vehicle to grab it, Ortol fired one shot from a handgun he kept within arm's reach. The bullet struck Maloney in the chest. Witnesses saw Maloney clutch his body and stumble, collapsing in or near the driveway. First responders pronounced him dead at the scene. Deputies then searched the van and recovered 3 handguns, including the one used in the shooting. Investigators noted that Ortol had arrived at the home with multiple firearms accessible to him, which later became a point of emphasis for the prosecution. Ortol was transported to a local hospital after the shooting, reportedly suffering a mild heart attack, and was later taken into sheriff's custody. He was charged with second-degree murder the following day. At his first court appearance, his attorney began outlining a self-defense argument, referencing Ortol's age, his limited mobility, and Florida's Stand Your Ground law. The defense's position was that Maloney had reached into the van aggressively, and that Ortol, unable to retreat because of his disability, believed he was under attack. Prosecutors countered with a straightforward narrative. A landlord angry about unpaid rent drove to the home, confronted his tenant, brought multiple guns to the scene, and shot Maloney during a verbal dispute. They argued that Maloney leaning into the van to retrieve his cell phone did not constitute a deadly threat, and that Ortol's decision to fire was driven by anger and poor judgment, not reasonable fear. The case proceeded through the Collier County court system for nearly 2 years. There is no indication in available records that Stand Your Ground immunity was granted. Instead, the matter went before a jury, with both sides presenting their versions of the confrontation and the available physical evidence. On May 29, 2015, jurors returned their verdict. They rejected Ortol's self-defense claim and found him guilty of second-degree murder. Because Florida law allows for a life sentence in such cases, multiple news outlets noted that Ortol, now 79, faced the possibility of spending the remainder of his life in prison. A sentencing date was set for July 6th. The judge allowed Ortol to remain free on bond while awaiting sentencing, citing his age and medical condition. But before the court could impose a sentence, investigators were called to Ortol's home in late June. They found him slumped in his electronic wheelchair and unresponsive. He was pronounced dead, ending the case before punishment could be formally handed down. Reports differ on the exact cause of death, but there was no indication of foul play. For the Collier County Sheriff's Office, the case represented a rare but clear example of a landlord-tenant dispute escalating into lethal violence. The evidence showed that Ortol went to the property specifically to confront Malone, brought multiple firearms with him, and fired a fatal shot during a disagreement about rent. The jury's decision reflects their conclusion that the threat described by Ortol did not justify the use of deadly force. And for the family of Edward Malone, the outcome meant that the person convicted of killing him never served a day of the life sentence he was facing. The events of that morning on Okeechobee Street remain documented through witness accounts, physical evidence, and the verdict that brought legal clarity to what took place between a frustrated landlord and a tenant whose overdue payments turned into a deadly encounter. Number 5. Dominic Coacher. In April 2009, at a terraced property on Hilton Court in Ellesmere Port, a French flight attendant named Christophe Bourgier was inside the kitchen, helping with what he believed was routine cleaning. The room had been lined with tarpaulin sheets. Plastic covered the benches, and a space had been cleared on the floor. It looked like preparation for a deep clean, but investigators later determined it had been set up for something else. The men who lived with him, landlord and controlling figure Dominic Coacher, along with associates Sebastian Bendu and Manuel Wagner, had turned the kitchen into a kill area. Christoph had moved to the United Kingdom the year before, relocating from France with friends who eventually settled in Ellesmere Port. He took a job as a Raineiro flight attendant, and he and one of his friends began living at a property controlled by Coacher. Over time, Coacher's influence over them grew beyond a normal landlord-tenant arrangement. He handled their money, dictated how their wages were spent, and created an environment where he acted as the head of the household and financial controller. Both Christoph and his friend paid their earnings directly into Coacher's bank account, giving him near total control over their day-to-day living. By early 2009, the relationship had deteriorated. Court records and investigator interviews show that Coacher held grievances related to money and personal disputes. Witnesses described Coacher's influence as unusual and, at times, manipulative. He had begun telling the others that Christoph could not be trusted, portraying him as a threat and encouraging a shared sense of suspicion. That narrative intensified in the weeks leading up to the murder. In the days before the attack, Coacher purchased knives, a cement mixer, bricks, and tarpaulin. Items investigators later described as materials for both the killing and the concealment. The kitchen was prepared with sheets of plastic to contain blood spatter. The outbuilding behind the house had been readied as well, with a cavity dug beneath the shed floor and bags of concrete positioned nearby. In late April, the three men lured Christoph into the kitchen. While he was kneeling and cleaning an area of the floor, the attack began. Investigators determined that he was struck repeatedly with hammers and stabbed with knives in a coordinated assault by the group. The injuries were extensive and fatal. Once Christoph was dead, the men wrapped his body in tarpaulin, bound it tightly, and carried it out to the shed. There, they placed the body into the cavity and encased it beneath layers of concrete, sealing him into what detectives later referred to as a concrete tomb. Almost immediately, Coacher shifted to creating the appearance that Christoph was still alive. He wrote an email to Christoph's family in France, claiming Christoph had gone on holiday or was traveling. Forensic linguists later analyzed the message and concluded that the writing style, grammar, and errors matched Coacher's own French, not Christoph's. Over the next 2 years, additional messages and postcards appeared, reinforcing the idea that Christoph had left voluntarily. During this time, Coacher, Bendu, and Wagner relocated to Scotland. The missing person inquiry continued, but without evidence of foul play, there was little progress. Christoph's body remained undiscovered beneath the concrete slab in the shed. Everything changed in April 2013. A distressed and confused Sebastian Bendu walked into a police station in Ellesmere Port and told officers he had killed a man years earlier and buried the body in a shed. Officers described him as agitated and showing signs of mental strain. Initially, his account lacked detail, but the reference to a body in a shed prompted police to check the Hilton Court address. When detectives arrived at the property, they found a solid concrete floor in the outbuilding. After breaking through the slab, they uncovered a tarpaulin-wrapped body. Forensic testing confirmed it was Christoph Bourgier. The post-mortem findings showed blunt force injuries consistent with hammer strikes and multiple stab wounds. Following the discovery, police arrested Coacher, Bendu, and Wagner. Evidence collected included the email Coacher had written in Christoph's name, financial records showing the flow of wages into Coacher's account, and witness accounts describing Coacher's influence over the two younger men. Prosecutors argued that Coacher was the orchestrator, the one who planned the killing, controlled the finances, and directed the others. In 2014, Coacher was convicted of murder at Preston Crown Court and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 23 years. Bendu was convicted later the same year and received life with a minimum of 14 years. Wagner was initially acquitted of assisting an offender, but the case was reopened after further evidence emerged, and in 2017, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life with a minimum of 16 years. For investigators, the case highlighted a destructive system of control where a landlord grew into a dominant, manipulative figure who governed the finances, living arrangements, and movements of the people within his home. Christoph's disappearance was initially hidden behind a false trail of messages, cash control, and a move across the border. It was only through a confession years later, driven in part by guilt and mental breakdown, that the truth emerged. By the time the case resurfaced in 2025 through new documentary coverage, the details had been firmly established through trials, forensic evidence, and confessions. Christophe Bourgier had been murdered in a planned, controlled assault, his body concealed for years beneath concrete in a shed behind the house where he once lived under Coacher's authority. The convictions that followed reflected the full extent of the planning, the brutality of the attack, and the deliberate effort to erase his existence after the killing. Number 6. Matthew Charles Draganoff. On March 8, 2021, in the outer suburban community of Virginia on Adelaide's northern fringe, 49-year-old Simon Middleton was moving belongings from a Brady Street property to a vehicle parked outside. It was early in the morning. According to later court findings, Middleton was in the process of vacating the home where he had been living rent-free. He was on the phone, unarmed, and preparing to leave when his landlord, Matthew Charles Draganoff, approached the property carrying a high-powered Marlin .3 .030 rifle. The relationship between the two men had deteriorated sharply in the weeks leading up to that morning. Prosecutors later described growing animosity and an accumulation of grievances held by Draganoff, including disputes over the sale of a stolen caravan, allegations of theft, and resentment that Middleton was living on his property without paying rent. 2 days earlier, on March 6th, a man who had been watching over another of Draganoff's properties told him there had been a break-in and that Middleton and several others were allegedly involved. That report became a significant catalyst in the Crown's version of the events that followed. By the early hours of March 8th, Middleton was clearly leaving the property. Justice Ann Bampton later noted that it was evident he was moving out, and that no further eviction steps were necessary. Despite this, Draganoff traveled to the Brady Street address, armed with a stolen rifle, even though he was under a firearms prohibition order that made possession illegal. What happened next was pieced together through witness accounts, forensic evidence, and CCTV footage presented during the 2-month Supreme Court trial. While Middleton was on the phone, a witness heard him say, "Oh no, don't shoot," followed by screaming and then 3 gunshots. Prosecutors said the first shot struck Middleton in the upper body at close range and was already fatal on its own. As he attempted to flee or crawl away, he was struck again, this time in the buttocks. The final shot, delivered to the head as he lay on the ground, was described in court as an execution-style killing. The forensic evidence supported this sequence. A pathologist told the court that the head and chest wounds were each independently fatal. DNA matching Draganoff was found on a spent cartridge case from the rifle, and Middleton's blood was found on a shoe later seized from Draganoff's belongings. Another witness testified that Draganoff asked him to dispose of the rifle and to burn his clothes. The witness did not do so, and police later recovered the clothing, including the shoe with the victim's blood on it. CCTV footage from the area, although grainy and captured at night, showed enough detail for the prosecution to argue that Draganoff used the rifle to shoot Middleton at close range before fleeing through a vacant block beside the house. From there, he made his way toward the Virginia Oval, where he was picked up by another individual. The defense argued the footage was too dark to identify the shooter conclusively, but the jury ultimately accepted the combination of CCTV, forensic evidence, and witness testimony. Police arrested multiple individuals in the aftermath, but by 2024, charges against a co-accused were withdrawn due to insufficient evidence. The Supreme Court prosecution proceeded solely against Matthew Charles Draganoff. His trial began in April 2025. The prosecution outlined the history of conflicts between the landlord and tenant and argued that the killing was deliberate, motivated by revenge, and executed with a stolen firearm. The defense maintained that the evidence did not prove, beyond reasonable doubt, that Draganoff fired the shots. After nearly 5 days of deliberations, more than 25 hours in total, the 12-member jury returned a verdict in June 2025, finding Draganoff guilty of murder. At sentencing, held on September 19, 2025, Justice Ann Bampton imposed the mandatory penalty of life imprisonment and set a non-parole period of 28 years. In her remarks, she called the murder a violent execution of an unarmed man who posed no threat at the time he was shot. She also noted that the animosity Draganoff held toward Middleton had been increasing and consuming in the days leading up to the killing. With that sentence, Draganoff will not be eligible for parole until 2049, when he will be approximately 73 years old. He has filed an appeal against his conviction, though the outcome remains pending. For the family of Simon Middleton, the events of that morning on Brady Street marked a sudden and devastating end to a long-strained landlord-tenant relationship that had escalated into lethal violence. The investigation that followed documented each moment, from the first shot captured on audio and CCTV to the forensic trail linking the weapon and clothing to the killer, ultimately revealing how a mix of resentment, property disputes, and perceived grievances ended in an execution-style murder carried out with a stolen rifle in the pre-dawn hours of a suburban street. Number 7. Chad Allen Reed. Chad Allen Reed spent years living on the first floor of a small duplex at 203 Post Avenue in Battle Creek, Michigan. His two upstairs tenants, 34-year-old Joseph Soule and 31-year-old Jacqueline Lapeard, had been renting the upper unit for months. Neighbors later told investigators the three of them argued often. Some disputes were about noise, others were described simply as tension that never improved. By the first week of October 2020, the relationship had broken down completely. On or around the 7th of October, Reed confronted Soule outside the home. The exact sequence differs slightly across reports, but police records agree on the core events. Reed told detectives that Soule pulled a knife during the argument and that he responded by firing his handgun. That shot ended Soule's life near the porch area of the property. As soon as Soule went down, the situation shifted to the backyard. Lapeard tried to escape the property, running toward the rear of the house in an attempt to get away, and Reed followed her. There, Lapeard was shot, struck multiple times, and eventually strangled with a ligature. Prosecutors later emphasized that her killing was prolonged and occurred after she fled the initial scene. Witness testimony and investigative reports described injuries consistent with both blunt force trauma and manual strangulation. When both tenants were dead, Reed began moving their bodies. Over the next several days, friends and family members tried contacting Soule and Lapeard and received no answers. It was during that same period that Reed wrapped both bodies in plastic, placed them in the bed of his pickup truck, and left the truck parked on the property. Investigators and later court testimony stated that Reed kept the bodies there for an extended period while he attempted to clean parts of the house. A tip eventually reached police that Reed had been using bleach inside the home. That information became one of the early indicators that something more serious had occurred. As concern for the missing tenants grew, searches intensified. Reed eventually moved the truck from the property to a nearby vacant garage or abandoned structure. Roughly 8 days after the couple were reported missing, detectives located the truck and discovered both victims inside. Once confronted with the evidence, Reed turned himself in to Battle Creek police. During interviews, he admitted to shooting Soule and to killing Lapeard in the backyard. Officers arrested him on 2 counts of open murder and multiple firearms-related offenses. He was booked into the Calhoun County Jail. When he appeared before a judge for arraignment, his bond was denied. Prosecutors cited the severity of the crime, the detailed confession, and Reed's prior felony history, which included assault with a dangerous weapon and a previous criminal conduct conviction. The Post Avenue home became the subject of additional incidents after Reed's arrest. It caught fire multiple times over the following months. According to verified reporting, the home burned at least once immediately after his court appearance, and later publications noted as many as 5 separate fires before the structure was eventually demolished. Reed has never been charged in connection with those fires, but the house where the killings occurred no longer exists. In 2022, the court ordered a psychiatric evaluation. A state psychiatrist found Reed competent to stand trial. The judge reviewed the findings and reached the same conclusion. The case proceeded to the Calhoun County Circuit Court. During trial, the defense again argued self-defense regarding Soule's death, repeating Reed's claim that Soule had a knife. Prosecutors countered with the physical evidence, the pursuit of Lapeard, the ligature-based strangulation, and the concealment of both bodies. They described the sequence as a deliberate escalation and emphasized the steps Reed took afterward: wrapping, hiding, transporting, and cleaning. In October 2023, a jury convicted Reed of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and 4 separate firearms charges. The panel rejected the self-defense argument. 2 months later, on the 8th of December, Judge Sarah Lincoln imposed Reed's sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge cited his criminal history, the brutality of the killings, the concealment of the bodies, and the profound impact on the families. She made clear that Reed would never be released. The killings of Soule and Lapierre illustrate how a landlord-tenant conflict can deteriorate into lethal violence when disputes escalate and intervention never comes. The arguments at the Post Avenue duplex were known to neighbors. Some described ongoing tension extending long before the final confrontation. Noise, disagreements about behavior, and general hostility were part of their daily lives in the residence they shared. Those disputes eventually became fatal. Reed is serving life without parole in the Michigan Department of Corrections. There is no possibility of supervised release under his sentence. The appeals process continues, but the legal record shows a final judgment supported by forensic evidence, Reed's own admissions, and a comprehensive jury verdict. The lives of Joseph Soule and Jacqueline Lapierre ended inside the property where they sought housing. Number 8. Arnaldo Lozano-Sanchez. In the early hours of August 10, 2021, inside a small pink one-story home on West Chicago Avenue in Las Vegas, several tenants were settling in for the night. The house was quiet, lights dim, and the rooms were separated by narrow hallways typical of older single-family homes near the downtown area. Just after midnight, tenants began hearing movement from the front portion of the house, movement they recognized as their landlord, 78-year-old Arnaldo Lozano-Sanchez. According to police reports and witness statements, the atmosphere in the house had been tense for days. Lozano-Sanchez had complained repeatedly about rent not being paid. One tenant told investigators that she urged him to use the court system if he wanted to evict anyone. He refused. He said he would handle it his way. That remark, documented in the arrest report and repeated in court, would take on a very different meaning less than a week later. Shortly after 12:23 a.m., a couple renting a room inside the home heard the first gunshot. The male tenant later told detectives that his girlfriend had stepped out into the hallway moments earlier. When he went to check, he found her down and unresponsive near the doorway. As he looked up, he saw Lozano-Sanchez standing in the hallway with a handgun. The witness reported that the landlord appeared to be smiling or laughing as he stood there holding the weapon. From there, the incident moved rapidly through the home. Another tenant, identified in court documents as a middle-aged man who had also been renting a room, opened his door after hearing the gunfire. According to the arrest report, the man shouted and tried to block the doorway, but Lozano-Sanchez pushed toward the room. The tenant's partner, a woman inside the room, began yelling for help. Several more shots were fired. When detectives later documented the scene, they determined the male tenant had been shot approximately 9 times. Despite the severity of his injuries, he survived long enough to escape the room and stagger outside as officers arrived. Patrol units reached the property within minutes of the first 911 calls. A woman lay face down in the driveway, already beyond medical help. Inside the home, officers found another woman dead from gunshot wounds. A wounded man made his way out of the house with extensive injuries and was rushed to a trauma center in critical condition. A handgun, believed by investigators to be the murder weapon, was located under a bush near the house. For nearly an hour, police maintained a perimeter while SWAT officers attempted to make contact with the elderly landlord. Just after 1 a.m., Lozano-Sanchez surrendered peacefully. In his first appearance before a judge later that day, he told the court, through a Spanish interpreter, that he did not know what he was being accused of. Prosecutors detailed the sequence of events and explained the motive: a rent dispute that escalated into a double homicide and an attempted murder. During the bail hearing, prosecutors emphasized the statement he made earlier in the week that he refused to go through eviction court because he wanted to handle the matter himself. They described the shootings as deliberate, targeted, and carried out in close quarters against tenants who were unarmed and had nowhere to retreat. The judge ordered him held without bail on 2 counts of open murder with the use of a deadly weapon and 1 count of attempted murder with the use of a deadly weapon. Over the next several years, the case moved slowly through the Clark County courts. Lozano-Sanchez underwent competency evaluations, and for a period he was found incompetent to stand trial and placed under commitment. In early 2025, he was ruled competent again, and a jury trial was scheduled for later that year. But on March 4, 2025, he died at the age of 82 in Las Vegas. Prosecutors filed a motion to close the case, and the court granted the request. There would be no trial, no verdict, and no sentence. For investigators and court officials, the case stood out because the underlying conflict was not extraordinary. It began as a common landlord-tenant dispute involving unpaid rent. But instead of following the legal eviction process, Lozano-Sanchez took the situation into his own hands, turning a civil disagreement into a deadly attack that claimed 2 lives and nearly a third. The victims never had the chance to defend themselves, negotiate, or leave safely. They were living inside a home where they should have been protected by the law. Instead, they were confronted by the person who legally controlled the property, someone who chose to enforce his authority with gunfire rather than the court system designed for exactly those disputes. By the time the case was closed in 2025, the details were firmly documented in arrest reports, AP coverage, and court records. A landlord who believed he was justified in bypassing the legal process had carried out one of the most disturbing rent-related killings in Las Vegas in recent years. And because he died before trial, the evidence collected, from witness statements, ballistic findings, and medical reports, remains the only account of how the confrontation unfolded. Number 9. Raineiro Espino Caballero. Late on Saturday, April 16, 2016, in a small residential property in Hialeah, Florida, a 76-year-old landlord named Raineiro Espino Caballero walked across the short distance between his living quarters and the attached efficiency unit he rented out. The space was compact, separated only by a sliding glass door and a few feet of concrete. Inside the unit lived 46-year-old Ramon Emilio Gutierrez Castillo, who had been behind on his rent for the month, $550 due on April 1st. According to police reports, Caballero approached the tenant shortly before midnight to collect the overdue payment. The conversation turned into an argument almost immediately. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices inside the small courtyard area, and investigators later confirmed that the dispute centered entirely on the unpaid $550. When the confrontation escalated, Gutierrez Castillo retreated into his efficiency apartment, closed the sliding glass door, and locked it from the inside to keep the landlord out. That simple action, locking the door, became the turning point in the case. Instead of walking away or contacting the courts for a legal eviction, Caballero turned and went back into his own living area on the same property. Police say he retrieved a firearm, walked back to the tenant's door, and positioned himself outside the locked glass. A short time later, the first shot shattered the sliding door. The bullet struck Gutierrez Castillo in the hip. The impact forced him further inside the small room, where officers later found signs of a struggle, a space barely large enough for a bed, a kitchenette, and a narrow walkway. Caballero stepped over the broken frame and entered the unit. At that moment, the tenant and the landlord came into close physical contact. According to the arrest affidavit, a physical struggle occurred inside the efficiency. During that struggle, Caballero fired again at extremely close range, shooting Gutierrez Castillo in the face. The wound was immediately fatal. Investigators found the victim deceased at the scene, surrounded by shattered glass and blood on the floor. Police arrived shortly after midnight, responding to emergency calls from neighbors who reported gunfire and shouting. Officers found the tenant dead and Caballero still on the property. He was detained without resistance and later admitted to police that he shot the tenant following the argument over the unpaid rent. The next morning, Caballero appeared in a Miami-Dade courtroom for his initial hearing. A judge reviewed the arrest report and the charges, first-degree murder and armed burglary, and ordered him held without bond. Prosecutors outlined the sequence of events: a rent dispute, a locked door, a landlord who armed himself, fired through the glass, forced entry, fought with the tenant inside, and delivered the fatal shot to the face at close range. Over the next year and a half, the case moved through the Miami-Dade court system. Because the charges included first-degree murder, the proceedings advanced directly into circuit court, where the state pursued a full prosecution. Court tracking summaries and sentencing lists later confirmed that the case went to final judgment. On November 28, 2017, Caballero was convicted of murder in Florida State Court and sentenced to life in prison. For investigators, the case was an example of a routine landlord-tenant disagreement turning into a fatal confrontation. There was no complex backstory, no long-term feud, and no hidden motive. It began with $550 in overdue rent and ended with a tenant dead in the efficiency he was renting and a 76-year-old landlord imprisoned for life. The physical layout of the property, the proximity between the landlord and tenant, and the quick escalation inside that small enclosed space all contributed to the deadly outcome. The decision to return with a weapon, shoot through a closed door, enter by force, and fire the fatal round at close range left prosecutors with little room for alternate interpretations. The act was treated as intentional, avoidable, and wholly disproportionate to the dispute that triggered it. Number 10. Thomas Chesnak. On the evening of October 24, 2014, the driveway of a modest home on Woodall Avenue in Cheektowaga, New York, became the center of an argument between a downstairs landlord and his upstairs tenant. 54-year-old Joseph Lawrence Jr. rented the upper unit of the house. His landlord, 53-year-old Thomas Chesnak, lived below him. They weren't strangers or adversaries on paper. They had known each other for years, and multiple family members described them as longtime friends. Earlier that day, the two men had been drinking together. By nightfall, both were intoxicated, and at some point, a disagreement started between them. Court records never spelled out the exact words that sparked it, only that it escalated in the driveway outside the home where both men lived. According to police and later testimony, the confrontation grew tense enough that Chesnak armed himself. He had a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson handgun with him as the argument continued by the side of the house. Witnesses and investigators reconstructed what happened next through physical evidence and the defendant's own statements. During the argument, Chesnak pressed the barrel of the handgun into Joseph Lawrence's abdomen. The gun discharged at point-blank range, sending a single round into Lawrence's stomach. The wound was catastrophic. First responders transported him to Erie County Medical Center, where surgeons attempted to save his life. He died during surgery that same night. Police arrested Chesnak at the scene. He was charged with second-degree murder and second-degree criminal possession of a weapon. Prosecutors emphasized the close-range nature of the gunshot and the fact that the landlord had been drinking heavily while armed. The early theory from the defense was self-defense, but the specifics of that claim never appeared clearly in open court summaries. What did emerge in the months that followed was a picture of a situation clouded by intoxication, personal history, and a volatile confrontation that escalated in seconds. The district attorney's office brought the case before a grand jury, and Chesnak was later arraigned in Erie County State Supreme Court, where the prosecution continued to pursue a murder conviction. The case went to trial the following year, not before a jury, but before New York State Supreme Court Justice Penny Wolfgang in a bench trial. During testimony, the judge heard evidence about the men's long relationship, their drinking that day, and the presence of the loaded handgun during the argument. In her ruling on July 1, 2015, Justice Wolfgang found Chesnak not guilty of second-degree murder. Instead, she convicted him of second-degree manslaughter. She explained her reasoning on the record. Carrying and handling a firearm while intoxicated, especially during a heated argument, constituted reckless behavior with fatal consequences. She did not find sufficient legal proof that Chesnak intended to kill or seriously injure Lawrence when he fired the shot, but she did find that his actions showed a disregard for the substantial risk of death. 2 months later, on September 2, 2015, Chesnak returned to the courtroom for sentencing. Lawrence's mother, Nancy Kimbrough, addressed the court and spoke about the loss of her only son. The judge then sentenced Chesnak to 5 to 15 years in state prison. Because he had been in custody since the night of the shooting in October 2014, he was eligible for parole after serving roughly 4 more years. By the time the sentence was imposed, the facts of the case were firmly established. A landlord living downstairs, a tenant living upstairs, an evening of drinking, an argument in the driveway, a handgun fired at point-blank range, and a death that unfolded in minutes. What had started as a dispute between two men who had known each other for years ended with one dead and the other serving a prison term for a reckless act that could never be undone. Cases like these reveal what happens when power, control, and unresolved resentment collide behind closed doors. These landlords didn't snap in an instant. Their decisions built up over days, months, and sometimes years of anger, entitlement, or manipulation. By the time the violence happened, the outcome was irreversible, and the people who trusted them, lived under them, or depended on them, paid the ultimate price. Most conflicts never need to go this far. A disagreement over rent, an eviction date, or a personal argument should never escalate into a loss of life. If you've been following the channel and you haven't subscribed yet, kindly hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and stay with us as we continue uncovering the real stories behind the most shocking cases. Stay safe. Until next time.